This reading is expressly for people who are blind or print disabled. My name's Eric. I'm going to be reading you selections from Barrons magazine, dated October 21st of 2024. The cover story has a headline that reads, "The Great Millennial Divide." Once dubbed the unluckiest generation, millennials are doing quite well financially, thanks partly to booming markets. But a deeper problem lurks behind the data. By Reshma Kapadia and Molly Cook Escobar. After Lindsay Peel lost her Baltimore banking job during the pandemic, she moved to Charlotte, North Carolina to start a financial coaching business, a transition made possible in part by help from her parents. Peel's parents, who started a plumbing business later in life, had also made savvy real estate moves. When Lindsay was 24, they were able to help her with a down payment on a single-family home in Baltimore. When she shifted gears in 2020, they gave her a small business loan. It took her 3 years to get back to her pre-pandemic earnings, but the rental income from the property eased the burden. My parents were able to create a solid financial foundation for me, and that's been monumental, says Peel, who landed a full-time job in 2023 and continues her financial coaching and literacy business on the side. Peel emerged from the pandemic in decent financial shape, and she was hardly alone. It turns out that many millennials, once dubbed the unluckiest generation, are faring better than baby boomers did at a similar age. Millennials in their early 30s saw their median wealth quadruple from 2019 to 2022, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. I expected that disruptions in the labor market would have drained a lot of accumulated wealth, but the safety nets that sprang up made a difference, says Lowell Ricketts, a data scientist at the St. Louis Fed and its Institute for Economic Equity. And those in the middle, with assets and housing, did well as the markets stabilized. But those gains weren't evenly shared. As the majority of millennials plowed ahead, a minority fell far behind. The wealth gap between those in the 80th percentile and 20th percentile, which takes out the extreme outliers among the richest and the poorest, is 20% wider among millennials than it was for boomers in 1989, according to number crunching the St. Louis Fed economists did for Barrons. In other words, millennials might be doing better than their predecessors, but they also might be the most economically divided generation that America's ever seen. An asset boost. Before the pandemic, millennials, a cohort born from 1981 to 1996, appeared to be falling behind in wealth accumulation. Not anymore. Millennials in the middle of the wealth spectrum held average assets of $103,021 in 2022, surpassing the $58,118 their boomer counterparts had held in 1992, adjusted for inflation. That's according to Rob Grutiers, a quantitative sociologist at the University of Bristol in England. Much of that increase was driven by those with homes, 401k retirement plans, or brokerage accounts that benefited from a booming stock market. COVID-era assistance like childcare tax credits and stimulus checks helped others chip away at debt or shore up savings. The gains during the pandemic offer a window into a surprising trend. The wealthiest 10% of millennial households in 2022 saw a 140% increase over the wealth their boomer peers had in 1992. Those in the middle saw a 77% increase. But the poorest 10% of households came out behind their boomer peers, according to Grutier's estimates for Barrons. While boomers started adulthood with a growing economic pie, millennials faced a roulette wheel. Economists note that the financial decisions that typically had secured a nudge up the wealth ladder, like a college education, home ownership, or investing, have become riskier. Millennials are the generation of unequals, and it showed up for them at the starting line, says Catherine Ann Edwards, a former Rand labor economist who is now a policy consultant to nonprofits and think tanks. That's made safety nets such as inheritances and family wealth even more valuable. Millennials who have been able to start the adulthood journey free of student debt and with a safety net to blunt the hit of layoffs or medical expenses enjoyed a leg up. Some even had enough cash to pounce on opportunities like historically low interest rates or cheap stocks. Thanks, Dad. Saba Dilawari, 34, credits an inheritance from her father for putting her on solid financial footing. After graduating with a 4-year degree in international relations and global health, Dilawari decided she didn't want to pursue more school. She tapped the money her father had left for further education to buy a condo in Brooklyn, New York. I feel very grateful for what my dad was able to provide, including an education without any of the student debt crippling the country, says the married mom, who has a newborn and now works in technology. The condo gave me a low mortgage and the ability to eventually earn income from a renter, money in the banana stand, in the event we needed it. Boomers are expected to pass some $27 trillion in wealth to millennials, well above half of the wealth transferred through 2045 will change hands among the richest 2% of Americans, according to Cerulli Associates. Not surprisingly, economists say such transfers widen the gap between rich and poor. A lot of people think about intergenerational wealth linkages as a bequest, but a lot of it is in vivo, during one's lifetime, helping with college expenses or a personal safety net, Ricketts says. The education gap. Those buffers start compounding early in adulthood. Take education. Long viewed as a gateway to the American dream, the college degree increasingly comes with risks, chipping away at its potential to unlock the door to financial security. There's still value in a 4-year degree, with those earning one accruing $1 million more on average over their lifetime than those without a degree, according to Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce. But that boost is smaller than it once was, and the economic mobility boost isn't as universal. The American Enterprise Institute found that about half of students from households in the 2 lowest income quintiles, which earn less than $46,000 annually, reached one of the 2 highest income quintiles by their early 30s after a college education. In contrast, almost 80% of those who started college in the 2 wealthiest quintiles moved up the earnings ladder. The source of inequality from 1900 to 2000 was largely due to whether someone had a college degree or not, according to Zachary Bleemer, assistant professor of economics at Princeton University. That has changed over Lowell Ricketts, data scientist at Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. A couple times a year, I'll Google how much you should have in retirement by age X. I'm getting to a point where I could put more into other investments to build wealth, but I'm nervous to move. The world seems very unstable the past 20 years. Starting with millennials, most of the growth in inequality has been among the college-educated, Bleemer says. Since the mid-1990s, minority college students have earned degrees in relatively less lucrative fields, while higher-income students have disproportionately flocked to higher-earning majors like computer science. That comes as universities are restricting access to lucrative majors to those with high grade point averages or experience in the field, according to Bleemer. He says that keeps out those who may not have had the same access to such prep, but who could have thrived if they'd been able to get into the major. The lifetime income gap between the highest and lowest paying college majors is $3.6 million, according to the Georgetown researchers. Debt burden. The debt some students accumulate on the way to their degrees compounds the problem. While more than a third of millennials took on debt to fund undergraduate degrees, a similar share to boomers in the 1980s, millennials graduated with an average loan balance of $29,000, compared with $12,000, adjusted for inflation, for boomers graduating in the early 1980s. As more people have gone to college, so-called credential inflation has crept into the workforce, with jobs increasingly requiring higher levels of education than a couple of decades ago. In the early 1990s, when younger boomers were a decade into their careers, less than 15% of quote-unquote good jobs required a graduate degree. Now that's up to 25% for millennials, according to the Georgetown researchers. Those with family help are often better equipped to pursue those higher degrees without adding to their debt burden, and decades of discriminatory policies that kept black families from building wealth have contributed to a racial wealth gap that leaves black young adults with substantially more debt than their white peers, according to research by Fanaba Addo, a public policy professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. If it's not completely closing off their opportunities to accumulate savings and assets, the debt has slowed down the transition to when they're reaching their goals, with studies showing that it delays milestones, Addo says of millennials who are struggling with debt. Talia Dunyak, 30, is living these delays. After graduating from Lehigh University and completing a Fulbright in Austria, Dunyak's $50,000 student debt persuaded her to stay in Europe to pursue a much less expensive graduate degree. She graduated into the pandemic, upending her plans to find an international development job and start chipping away at her debt. Instead, Dunyak ran up her credit card bill trying to get back to the U.S. and moved in with her parents in New Jersey. About 400 applications later, she found a part-time public relations job that eventually turned full-time, allowing her to return to Europe and then pay down her debt and catch up on retirement savings. She's whittled her debt down to $36,000, a level that still leaves her European friends aghast. They ask me how I can live. They don't get that Americans view it as almost part of life, Dunyak says. It's crazy to think that when my parents were at this point in their lives, they were married, they had a kid, and they owned a house. And by 30, we're on to a nicer home. The housing gap. Home ownership still seems a reach for Dunyak, and she isn't alone. While millennials have been buying more homes since the pandemic, their home ownership rate was 51% in 2022, the generation continues to buy homes at a slower pace than previous groups. Just a third of millennials are homeowners by age 30, compared with almost half of boomers at that stage of life. Almost a fifth of men and 12% of women ages 25 to 34 live in their parents' home, a sharp rise from 11% of men and 7% of women in 1960, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Those who had some wealth, financial help, or no student debt were able to capitalize on low interest rates and see their net worth climb along with the surge in home prices. Those left out are stuck renting and are stung by inflation. During the pandemic, millennial homeowners saw a median $78,000 increase in wealth, while renters saw a $6,200 gain, according to a new report by the Aspen Institute. A lucky couple. Stacy and Kyle Davis were in the lucky camp. The couple met at Northwestern University and married soon after graduating. While Stacy graduated with about $14,000 in debt, she landed a job at a local newspaper. Kyle pursued a master's in library science and was able to pay for the degree with part-time work and some parental help. As the subprime crisis came to an end in 2010, the couple was positioned to buy their first home, tapping first-time homebuyer incentives to jump on slumping real estate prices. They also emerged from the pandemic in decent shape, able to lean on parents to help with their two boys as childcare expenses soared. We feel secured and lucky in our timing and have had a lot of advantages, Stacy says. While she wishes for a slightly bigger financial cushion, the family has enough that she doesn't have to scrutinize the budget for small splurges, like a school trip for her son. But others, like Brian McGee, a 42-year-old cybersecurity analyst in Colorado, sees the opportunity of joining the homeowner class slipping away. Rent and housing-related expenses eat up most of the income of the married father of one, getting in the way of the family's ability to save and invest more. It's frustrating because I have to monitor my bank account. I don't like that, and I shouldn't have to at this point, says McGee, who now feels like his 4-year degree from an out-of-state technical college was a waste, as it wasn't recognized by employers and it delayed his career trajectory. Stocks to the rescue. While millennials are behind previous generations in home ownership, they are ahead in investing in the stock market, another pillar for financial security, starting at an average age of 25 versus 35 for boomers. The majority of Americans who own stocks do so through employer-facilitated retirement plans like 401ks, and 60% of millennials have access to work-based retirement plans. At the same time, 30 million millennials lack access to such a plan, a group that often overlaps with those shut out of the housing market or saddled with student debt. But access to a plan doesn't always translate to financial security. The median balance in Vanguard retirement accounts of 25 to 34-year-olds totaled $35,537 in 2023. That's far from the $500,000 millennials on average in a Transamerica survey that they would need for retirement, and even further from the $1.2 million experts think is more realistic. Asset accumulation by race and gender also differ, even when controlling for income and tenure among workers, according to a study by Morningstar and the Aspen Institute. One big reason? Hardship withdrawals, often used by minorities and women. Crisis overload. The backdrop of crises during the early part of millennials' adulthood journey left scars that show up in other areas, including investing habits, spending behavior, and career choices, all of which ripple through to the economy and policy. When you live through traumatic experiences, the synapses that are formed can be more deeply ingrained, and the scars impact behavior, says Ulrich Malmendier, a finance professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Haas School of Business. That includes saving more as a contingency plan or sticking with a safe job rather than taking a risk on something new. Earnings trajectories of those who graduate into a recession lag behind those who entered the labor force in more prosperous times, according to Malmendier. Dunyak's scars may explain her behavior. A couple times a year, I'll Google how much you should have in retirement by age X, she says. I'm getting to a point where I could put more into other investments to build wealth, but I'm nervous to move. The world just seems very unstable. A similar feeling has kept Jesse Sandberg hesitant to take outsized risks, even though his journey's been a bit smoother. After graduating debt-free from college in 2009, Sandberg quickly secured a job in advertising. An investment account seeded with bar mitzvah money expanded alongside the bull market, giving him a cushion to leave his day job and start a new business. Still, Sandberg describes himself as a hedger, opting for a more balanced approach to investing and steering clear of the riskier parts of the market. There are some serious political implications to millennials' economic uncertainty. Lack of financial resources can easily translate into increases in the inequality of opportunity, which have negative economic, social, and political consequences, says Mohammed El-Erian, chief economic advisor at Allianz, and that can undermine the economy's potential, weaken social cohesion, and fuel polarization, he adds. The more immediate fallout of a generation this large, feeling financially adrift, is showing up in the populism evident in both presidential candidates' proposals, such as increased help for childcare. Continued financial angst among millennials could fuel a push for safety nets for those lacking them, including a fight to preserve Social Security, a program some had assumed wouldn't be there for them. Securing or enhancing social programs could rattle markets, whether they're paid for through higher taxes or they add to the already burgeoning federal deficit. Our next headline: Costco is downstairs and the living is easy. The chain signed on to its first residential mixed-use building in Los Angeles, signaling a potential shift in its real estate strategy. By Sabrina Escobar. It won't be long before a select few Costco wholesale fans in Los Angeles will be able to live just a few flights above their favorite retailer. Thrive Living, a California-based developer, is converting a vacant lot in the Baldwin Village neighborhood of the city into an amenity-rich apartment building complete with 800 rentable units, a rooftop pool, a gym, and a basketball court. The most appealing amenity, however, might just be the Costco wholesale warehouse slated to take up the ground floor, complete with a pharmacy and optical services. That alone makes the mixed-use building, a term used to describe a real estate project that blends residential and commercial spaces, unique. It's the first time Costco is leasing a space in a residential development like this one. Getting Costco on board is a significant win for Thrive, experts say. Everyone loves to be next to Costco and have Costco associated with their projects, says Michael Poulin, Vice President of National Accounts at Shopcore, a commercial real estate firm. They just bring so many good things, and real estate's a part of that. Long term, however, the biggest upside may be for Costco and its shareholders. The retailer's move could set a new precedent for its urban expansion strategies, giving Costco more flexibility to tap into densely populated areas and then position itself closer to where shoppers live. It's kind of surprising to me they wouldn't have done it previously, says Karen Short, an analyst at Melius Research. From a real estate perspective, it's a home run, she adds. So what's the big deal? Well, mixed-use developments have become one of the most popular forms of construction over the past decade, answering consumer demand for easy, walkable access to favorite shops and restaurants. And while mixed use has been historically favored in urban areas, where people have grown accustomed to living above retailers, the development style has become a favorite in suburban areas as well. That's what people are looking for today in retail development, says Rudolph Millien, CEO of Woodcliff Realty Advisors. Developers are happy to oblige. For landlords, mixed-use buildings are a way to diversify income streams and sign on commercial tenants, which often have lower turnover than residential ones. Retailers benefit as well, receiving a steady flow of foot traffic and recurring spending by the residents. Some of Costco's competitors, including Target and Whole Foods, have already wholeheartedly adopted the model, jumping at the chance to set up shop ever closer to consumers. But for Costco, the format's a novelty. The company's real estate strategy is typically leaned toward owning and developing the land it builds its warehouses on, and its designs rarely stray from the cavernous one-floor shop customers have come to know and love. It had never signed onto a project with housing on top, at least not in the U.S. So what's behind the company's change of heart? Representatives for Costco didn't answer Barrons' request for comment, but in a breaking ground ceremony in L.A. last month, Sean Mackin, Costco's regional administrative manager, said that the initiative partially stemmed from the company's struggles finding suitable venues for additional warehouses. Getting additional Costcos in Los Angeles is difficult. There's not a lot of free land, and through creative efforts and creative means, this is going to be the first of its kind in the United States for Costco, Mackin said. Costco's buy-in alone marks an important first for the development, yet it isn't the only one. The building at Baldwin Village is the first to get the go-ahead from a new state law, Assembly Bill 2011, that streamlines approvals for projects aimed at providing affordable housing. Just under a quarter of the development's apartments will be dedicated to low-income housing, Thrive says. The upside. Investors may also be winners in the long run. At the very least, the new store allows Costco to keep growing market share in California, the company's most important market within the United States. The state comprised 27% of the retailer's total U.S. sales in fiscal 2024. The company has 140 warehouses throughout the state, and a little over a third of them are concentrated in Southern California. The Baldwin Village Costco will be the company's 53rd store in Southern California. The retailer's decision also reflects a growing willingness to experiment with new formats, particularly its hard-to-access markets, which could lead to more mixed-use projects in the future. Based upon interactions with Costco and other retailers that have contacted us as they heard about this project, this is a formula that's going to be replicated for sure, said Ben Schul, founder of Thrive Living. The new development could open up new revenue streams for Costco, particularly because the company owns so much of its own real estate, says Short, the Melius analyst. As of the company's latest annual filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission, Costco owned 703, or just under 80%, of its 890 properties. If the current multi-use development goes well, Costco might be tempted to build residences on its existing properties or sell the air rights for others to develop, Short says. Granted, not all of these locations will be well suited for apartment buildings, she acknowledges that, but some of them might. Most analysts haven't factored this real estate opportunity into their models for Costco, Short says, including herself. Perhaps rightly so. After all, it is just one store, and the company likely won't overhaul a reliable real estate strategy that helped drive the stock 35% higher this year alone. But it's worth monitoring what the company does next. Costco's management team is deliberate, experts say, and they rarely make a move without the assurance it will ultimately pay off. Our next headline: Economists hate tariffs, but voters love them. Donald Trump embraced tariffs while president and plans even more of them if re-elected. Kamala Harris promises targeted tariffs if elected. This is written by Kenneth G. Pringle. Milton Friedman was in hostile territory, Kansas, one of the biggest recipients of agricultural subsidies, when he argued against trade protectionism. We call a tariff a protective measure, the Nobel Prize-winning economist said in a 1978 lecture at Kansas State University. It does protect. It protects the consumer very well against one thing. It protects the consumer against low prices. Friedman was under no illusions about making converts. As he pointed out, economists since Adam Smith had been almost unanimous on the subject of the desirability of free trade. Yet proponents of protectionism, that is, government restriction on international trade to support domestic industry, have often won the political day. Protectionism is again ascendant globally. Former President Donald Trump, a self-proclaimed tariff man in his first term, placed tariffs on goods from China and allies, including the European Union and Canada. He also increased subsidies to farmers that were hurt by retaliatory tariffs. The Republican presidential nominee has called for more tariffs, up to 60% on Chinese goods if elected again. Democrats, too, have embraced protectionism. The Biden administration kept most of Trump's tariffs and added some of its own. Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee, didn't respond to inquiries on her economic policies, but a campaign spokesman previously said that Harris would employ targeted and strategic tariffs to support American workers, strengthen our economy, and hold our adversaries accountable. It's no secret why both parties are suddenly proudly protectionist. Polls and studies show it's a political winner. But is it an economic winner? Do tariffs help American workers strengthen the economy and hold adversaries accountable? That's less clear. Until the 20th century, trade took the form of commercial warfare known as mercantilism. Nations tried to win the exchange war, exporting more than they imported to fill their treasuries with gold and to empty those of rivals. Protectionists today still see a positive trade balance as a sign of economic strength, and they use the same tools to achieve it. Tariffs, which are taxes on imports that's paid by importers, quotas that limit the quantity of some imports, and government subsidies paid to domestic industries. The goal is to protect domestic producers from low-price foreign merchandise, but domestic consumers, conversely, are denied those low prices and pay more for the same products. Every such law, therefore, imposes a real tax upon the whole country, Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, making the case against protectionism that Friedman and generations of economists have since adopted. Free traders didn't have their day until after World War II, which, among other things, escalated out of a global trade war. A new consensus emerged from the wreckage. From then on, wrote Cordell Hull, the former U.S. Secretary of State, unhampered trade dovetailed with peace. High tariffs, trade barriers, and unfair economic competition with war. The consensus mostly held through the end of the century, but calls for protectionism rose during tough economic times like the late 1970s, with its soaring inflation and unemployment. Friedman, in his 1978 Kansas lecture, bemoaned a widespread move for protection on products from steel to TV sets, textiles, and even shoes from Italy. Months later, labor leader George Meany called free trade a joke and a myth, echoing skeptics such as Robert Lighthizer, who was Trump's U.S. trade representative and architect of his tariff regime. A lawyer, he spent years defending the steel industry from foreign competition. Calling America's free trade experiment a starker, more indisputable failure than even I could have predicted, Lighthizer blames it for stagnant wages and the loss both of manufacturing jobs and national prestige. He wants to reset U.S. trade using tariffs as a blunt negotiating tool. Lighthizer calls for a strategic decoupling with China, arguing that the normalization of trade relations in 2000 was based on naive assumptions about Beijing's goals. The reality is that China is a mercantilist nation that wants to impose its system on the world, he wrote in his 2023 book, No Trade is Free. Attempts to reach Lighthizer for comment were unsuccessful. Has his get-tough approach worked? The U.S. trade deficit widened since 2016 to $79 billion from $40 billion. America is importing fewer goods from China, according to a Federal Reserve study, but Chinese exports have increased to other trading partners. Another analysis from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that tariffs had little effect on jobs in newly protected sectors, while retaliatory tariffs had, quote, clear negative employment impacts, quote, only partly mitigated by new agricultural subsidies. Still, the trade war was a political success, according to the NBER study, with residents of regions affected by import tariffs becoming more likely to support Trump and Republicans. Polls show that Americans prefer Trump's trade approach. Democrats want some of that, and if Trump is reelected, Lighthizer is poised to continue reshaping U.S. trade policy, calling his efforts in Trump's first term a darn good beginning. Whoever wins, be prepared to pay dearer than before for certain goods, as Smith warned. Our next headline's from the funds section of Barrons for this week. Emerging Market Funds with Room to Run by Debbie Carlson. Emerging market stocks are posting some of their best gains in years, with the benchmark MSCI Emerging Markets Investable Market Index up 15% year to date. And they're poised to build on the bullish momentum as the Federal Reserve and other central banks cut interest rates. Combined with cheap valuations, now may be a good time for investors to add a small allocation of emerging market equities to their portfolio. Historically, emerging markets benefit when the Fed cuts rates and engineers a soft landing, says Derek Irwin, portfolio manager for the intrinsic emerging markets equity team at Allspring Global Investments. Economic strength in India and Taiwan has boosted emerging markets, and the sector is riding a tailwind of global liquidity as other big central banks turn dovish. The Fed rate cuts have pressured the U.S. dollar as well. Greenback strength over the past decade has played into emerging market underperformance, Irwin says. The Fed's move also gave some emerging market central banks cover to cut rates, such as in South Africa and Mexico. Post-Fed, China also delivered a big stimulus package to prop up its flagging economy, which recently has boosted emerging market indexes. The landscape has changed since the early 2000s when the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, last outperformed. China no longer overshadows other countries as a major index constituent. India now plays a big role, with each country comprising around 21%. South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, and Thailand are now also in the top 10. Irwin says the gains in emerging markets will spread beyond India and Taiwan. He sees value in high-quality companies in South Africa and Southeast Asia, where improvement in global liquidity could boost companies' bottom lines. Todd Rosenbluth, head of research at TMX Verify, a data and analytics company, says investors might consider the $3 billion Wisdom Tree Emerging Markets High Dividend Exchange Traded Fund, ticker DEM, which is yielding 5%. Carlos Sanabria, investment specialist at Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, says if gains in emerging markets continue, an actively managed mutual fund such as the $3.3 billion Driehaus Emerging Markets Growth, DREGX, could benefit. Its managers use a momentum strategy, picking businesses experiencing continuous growth. The bounce in Chinese stocks following Beijing's stimulus has some investment banks, such as Goldman Sachs, overweighting Chinese shares. Irwin remains underweight the country, waiting to see how China's move eventually affects its economic data. Whether China unleashes more stimulus or not, positive comments from Chinese politicians are just as important since they drive economic policy. Valuations and macroeconomic tailwinds make a solid argument for a small allocation between 5 and 10% to emerging markets. However, market participants acknowledge that investors may sit out this higher-risk asset class until after the U.S. presidential election. Republican candidate Donald Trump has vowed to put significant tariffs on China. Steve Connors, founder of Connors Wealth Management, is using 2 emerging market ETFs that don't include Chinese and Hong Kong markets. The $1.2 billion Columbia EM Core ex-China, XCEM, and the $893 million Freedom 100 Emerging Markets, FRDM. These diversified funds give investors greater exposure to smaller emerging markets without having to buy single-country funds, he says. He says these funds not only benefit from Fed rate cuts and a weaker dollar, but are also a way to sidestep the potential impact of the U.S. election, regardless of who wins. From the tech trader portion of this week's Barrons, ASML saved Moore's Law, then it wrecked the market. ASML may have just 5 customers for its EUV machines, but the entire semiconductor sector is downwind of its technology, and that explains the brief stock market panic this past week. ASML's third quarter earnings leaked a day early. The market was caught off guard in more ways than one. ASML's outlook was weak, and the worries sparked an industry-wide panic. Why did ASML's update sour everyone on the whole chip industry? How did ASML, a company not known to many investors, become so central to the sector? The answer stems from Moore's Law. Moore's Law isn't really a law, but rather a prediction made in 1975 by semiconductor pioneer Gordon Moore. He said the number of transistors that could be etched into silicon would double every 2 years. As Moore's Law is generally understood, you get twice the chip for the same price or less every 2 years. Well, this prediction held up pretty well until recently, when tinier and tinier transistors ran up against the limits of ultraviolet light wavelengths that are used to etch them into silicon. Enter Dutch-based ASML, a manufacturer of semiconductor lithography machines. Over 2 decades ago, ASML saw where things were headed and began working on extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography machines with even smaller wavelengths, allowing for the creation of ever smaller transistors. ASML says it invested more than 6 billion euros, about $6.5 billion, in EUV research and development over 17 years. After several false starts, the company was able to harness the very tiny wavelengths that are needed to manufacture high-performance chips that are used in smartphones, PCs, and data centers. Ultimately, ASML's EUV machines saved Moore's Law. ASML once described how EUV works like this. To generate extreme ultraviolet EUV light, a CO2 laser fires two separate laser pulses at a fast-moving drop of tin. This vaporizes the tin and creates EUV light. It does this up to 50,000 times per second. It could be straight out of a science fiction novel. EUV machines are unique to ASML. It has competition in its less advanced lithography machines from the likes of Canon, but no one else can make the EUV variety. There are currently 5 major customers for EUV machines: Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, Samsung, Micron, and SK Hynix. The cost of a single ASML machine can top 350 million euros. ASML's customers use the machines for a variety of applications. Without EUV, the chips in smartphones, PCs, and NVIDIA graphics processing units, or GPUs, would be less efficient and much slower. That means chip designers like Apple, Advanced Micro Devices, AMD, and NVIDIA are dependent on ASML, and so are companies manufacturing their chips, including Taiwan Semiconductor and Samsung. Even in China, where ASML is restricted to selling its less advanced machines, manufacturers can't get enough of ASML lithography. In the just reported third quarter, China accounted for 47% of ASML revenue. ASML may have just 5 EUV customers, but the entire semiconductor sector is downwind of its technology, and that brings us back to this past week's sell-off. Wall Street had been focused on ASML's outlook for 2025 when multiple trends were seen to be converging. More advanced manufacturing processes from Intel, TSMC, and Samsung are set to get going next year. And that presumably creates high demand for ASML's highest-end EUV machine, the one that costs 350 million euros or more. And there's a wave of government-subsidized semiconductor factories beginning to open. There are manufacturing subsidies in the US, EU, China, South Korea, India, and elsewhere. These economies all want to achieve some level of semiconductor independence, and any new factories will require the purchase of more machines from ASML. For several years now, ASML has been guiding to a revenue range of 30 billion euros to 40 billion euros for 2025. As recently as 3 months ago, the company suggested that 2025 would be closer to the top of that range than the bottom. As it relates to 2025, we're very consistent, I think, in our messaging, and that's what we want to say. Chief Financial Officer Roger Dason told investors July 17th. We confirm what we said in November of 2022, which is we expect 2025 to be between 30 and 40 billion euros. We've already said it's not the low point of that guidance. Wall Street analysts had settled on an estimate of 35.8 billion euros for ASML's 2025 sales. But in reporting its third quarter this week, ASML forecasts those 2025 sales at 30 to 35 billion euros, at the bottom half of the previous range. Yep, cue the sell-off. The change in outlook reflects lower demand from one or more of ASML's EUV customers. But it also means that demand for manufacturing services from the chip designers may be faltering, which would imply weak demand for traditional semiconductors in smartphones, PCs, and servers. ASML emphasized that the problem wasn't related to demand for artificial intelligence chips. That means NVIDIA's GPUs could be immune to the concerns. Strong earnings from Taiwan Semiconductor on Thursday also suggested the news wasn't quite so gloomy for the broader chip sector. But ASML's warning still stands out because of the company's vital role across the supply chain. ASML's problem is everyone's problem. And that was reported by Adam Levine. And from the economy section of this week's Barrons, dated October 21st, Why the Fed's Balance Sheet Reduction Matters by Nicholas Jasinski. For all the attention on the Federal Reserve's possible interest rate moves in 2024 and beyond, there's another area of policy that's boring by comparison, but nearly as important: the Fed's steady reduction in its balance sheet, known as quantitative tightening. Never mind the cognitive dissonance of simultaneously easing policy by lowering rates and tightening by shrinking the balance sheet. For now, no news is good news as far as the Fed's balance sheet is concerned. The balance sheet is key to the Fed's implementation of monetary policy. Banks hold reserves at the Fed, on which they earn a risk-free return that effectively acts as a floor for rates across the financial system. It's used to guide the federal funds rate, the Fed's primary benchmark interest rate, which it cut to a target rate of 4.75 to 5% in September. Banks and other financial institutions can also lend their U.S. Treasury holdings to the Fed in exchange for cash to meet liquidity needs in transactions that are known as repurchase agreements or repos. During times of financial crisis or stress, the Fed can use its balance sheet to quickly inject cash into the economy and keep the gears of credit turning. It did so forcefully during the pandemic. Assets on the Fed's balance sheet ballooned from about $4.2 trillion at the start of 2020 to nearly $9 trillion at its 2022 peak, as it purchased vast quantities of U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Since March of 2022, the Fed has been shrinking its balance sheet, which was down to $7 trillion this past week. Officials slowed the process in June. The Fed is currently allowing up to $25 billion in treasuries and up to $35 billion in mortgage-backed securities to mature monthly without reinvesting the proceeds. By allowing those securities to run off without buying new ones, the Fed is slowly reducing banking reserves, meaning less cash to lend. That should put upward pressure on bond yields. That's seemingly at odds with Fed rate cuts. Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco President Mary Daly explained the contradiction as one of timing. The interest rate adjustment is like a speedboat, and the balance sheet is like a tanker ship, she said at an NYU event on Tuesday. And the question is, do you want your main policy tool to wait on the tanker ship to turn in order for it to turn? For Fed officials eager to characterize rate moves as normalization, shrinking the balance sheet to pre-crisis levels fits the same logic. A well-telegraphed, slow and steady drawdown is unlikely to have much economic impact, argued Fed Gov. Christopher Waller, in contrast with rapid balance sheet growth in a financial crisis. Waller said at Stanford University on Monday that he isn't concerned about a September 2019-like experience during an earlier round of QT, when the repo market briefly seized up and the Fed responded by boosting reserves. Waller compared the Fed's balance sheet moves to firefighters. You have a bad economic outcome, you pour water on the fire, and then when the fire's out, you drain the water away, he said. And when the water drains away, the fire doesn't restart. That's the asymmetry of the policy action. For now, reserves are abundant, based on a new metric unveiled by the New York Fed. The Reserve Demand Elasticity, or RDE, tool shows that reserve shifts currently have little impact on the Fed funds rate, meaning the Fed can comfortably continue QT into 2025, barring an unexpected economic or financial shock. Policymakers want to keep shrinking the balance sheet until reserves are merely ample, know-it-when-you-see-it level of cash. That appears to be a ways off, and officials are sanguine about getting there without breaking anything. A sidebar story from the cover: companies need more immigrants, but they dare not admit it. Voters will soon decide whether Trump or Harris will handle the immigration crisis. The stakes for U.S. businesses and the economy are high, by Joe Light. To get a sense of the immigration crisis, look no further than Amazon.com. The company was the largest sponsor of H-1B work permits for skilled foreign workers over the past 3 years, and it would probably hire far more if it was allowed. It's also chronically short of warehouse workers, and since 2022 has run a program to help refugees get work at the company. Yet Amazon, like many U.S. businesses, would almost certainly face a backlash if it pushed for more immigration. Public opinion has hardened on undocumented immigrants, and more restrictions may be coming regardless of whether Donald Trump or Kamala Harris prevails in the November election. The consequences matter. The labor market, while softening, remains tight, with 1.2 job openings per unemployed person. Immigration, meanwhile, ranks as a top issue for voters. How it's handled by Trump or Harris, along with the next Congress, will affect the country's economic growth, labor markets, and the U.S. fiscal deficit. None of it positively if immigration is curbed, according to nonpartisan forecasts. Much of what U.S. businesses want is clear. More work permits for immigrants and visas for their families. Wary of the optics, however, most companies are expressing this view through groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has lobbied Congress to increase work permits for years. Amazon didn't respond to requests for comment about its stance on immigration policies. Expanding the labor pool with immigrants helps companies because it gives them more employees to choose from and allows them to potentially pay less. Academic studies have found that high immigration has the biggest impact on low-skilled workers. Studies also find that other immigrants bear the brunt of competition more than workers who are already well established in the country. That's not to say that there aren't pressures. Some economists have found that skilled workers brought in under programs like H-1B visas get paid less than peers already working in the country, leading tech firms to keep hiring workers from abroad even as they lay off others. The short-term negatives are only half the picture, though. The broader macroeconomic effects of immigration tend to fuel consumption and economic growth, and they keep a lid on wage inflation, according to many economists. That dynamic was evident over the past few years as the U.S. added 5 million people to the workforce through immigration, counting both documented and undocumented workers. That surge coincided with pandemic-induced labor shortages and a big economic rebound afterward. Inflation surged, but it would have been worse without immigration helping push down wage growth, according to Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi. Immigration has been very costly to many communities across the country, but the timing of the surge was very fortuitous from a macroeconomic perspective, he says. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office sees net gains from immigration trends. It estimates from 2021 to 2026, 8.7 million more people will have entered the U.S. than it previously expected, with 65% of them unlawfully present, quote unquote. That influx will boost nominal gross domestic product by $8.9 trillion over the next 10 years, from 2024 to 2034. And in 2034, real GDP will be 2.9% greater because of the immigration surge, the CBO said in a July report. The CBO also estimates that the immigration surge will reduce deficits by $900 billion by 2034. Many migrants receive authorization to work. They get jobs and pay taxes, but in part because they aren't immediately eligible for some tax deductions and federal benefits, the net effect on the deficit is positive. Much will depend on whether border policies keep tightening. The White House in September toughened an executive order that's made it nearly impossible for migrants to receive asylum outside of official ports of entry. The number of monthly encounters between border officials and migrants attempting to cross the southern border without authorization is down more than 76% since early 2023. Scores of immigrants may also be forced to leave under some recent Biden administration policies. Partly to ease border pressures, the president expanded a humanitarian parole program that lets migrants from some countries work in the U.S. for up to 2 years. That's allowed hundreds of thousands of migrants from Haiti, Venezuela, and other countries to stay. However, the Department of Homeland Security in early October said the program won't be extended, potentially forcing many migrants to leave. Trump wants a major crackdown. Along with spreading false rumors that Haitian migrants are eating pets, he's blamed immigrants for higher housing costs, despite scant evidence that's the case nationally, and more evidence that building costs would be higher without influxes of workers from Latin America. He has said he dislikes more orderly pathways for foreign workers, like the H-1B visa program, which allows high-skilled workers to enter the country and potentially pursue permanent residency. Trump has also promised to embark on the largest deportation in the history of our country. Asked about the impact that would have on the economy, Trump said, "I want a lot of people to come into our country, but I want them to come in legally," speaking at an event at the Economic Club of Chicago last Tuesday. President Trump's mass deportation of illegal immigrants will not only make our community safer, but will also save Americans from footing the bill for years to come, said RNC Republican National Committee spokeswoman Taylor Rogers in a statement. Harris's immigration policies would probably be a continuation of Joe Biden's. She's lambasted Trump for killing a bipartisan border deal earlier this year, and she promised to revive it. The bill made fewer people eligible for asylum, while increasing resources for asylum officers and border agents. It also increased the number of visas available for legal immigration. The Harris campaign referred Barrons to a speech that the vice president made near the U.S.-Mexico border in which she vowed to keep the border closed outside of official ports of entry while creating a path to citizenship for hardworking immigrants who've been here for years and deserve to have a system that works. Companies are in a tough spot. Employers in sectors such as agriculture, construction, and education rely on immigrants for a growing percentage of their workforce. Yet many of these immigrants have temporary work permits that could be revoked over the coming years. Silicon Valley's in a bind too. While some tech leaders support Trump, notably Tesla CEO Elon Musk, much of the industry would be hurt by his immigration policies. Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Meta, and Apple are all among top 10 sponsors of H-1B visas. Since 2005, the number of new H-1B visas, a main conduit for foreign tech workers, has been capped at 85,000, though thousands more are granted in other industries and to universities. In Trump's first term, denial rates for H-1Bs soared, reaching a peak of 24% in 2018. The White House also told immigration officials to end a policy that gave deference to the findings of previous visa petitions, making it harder for workers to get extensions. Biden revoked those orders, and the denial rate fell to 3.5% last year. In the past fiscal year, the U.S. issued more than 265,000 such visas. That's up from 180,000 in 2018. Immigration attorneys say clients are rushing to get visa applications in, worried that Trump would seek another slowdown if reelected. The last Trump administration saw this invisible wall go up, just constant policy changes that hindered the processing of applications, says Seattle immigration attorney Tamina Watson. Companies, meanwhile, risk political reprisals if they come out in favor of immigration. Tyson Foods, for instance, committed in 2022 to hire 2,500 migrants through a nonprofit called Tent Partnership for Refugees. That, in part, prompted America First Legal, a Trump-affiliated group run by his advisor Stephen Miller, to file federal employment complaints this year against Tyson, alleging discrimination against American citizens. Tyson said in a statement, "Any insinuation that we would cut American jobs to hire immigrant workers is completely false." The company added that it only hires immigrants legally authorized to work, and it doesn't discriminate against American citizens. Other companies working with Tent include Amazon, Hilton, Blackstone, and Marriott International. Tells Barrons it has hired more than 1,000 refugees in the U.S. toward a commitment with Tent to hire 1,500 by 2025. Tent said in March that it was 70% of the way to a goal of getting 22,725 refugees higher. Some lobbyists hope pressure from U.S. businesses will soon pay off. We're slowly getting to that point where the cost of inaction will be greater than the cost of doing something, said John Basilici, Vice President for Immigration Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And when that happens, we'll finally see some changes. Yet, more restrictions look likely no matter who becomes the next president. If Biden's current policies continue through 2025, job growth would drop by 60,000 a month in 2025, and annual GDP growth would fall from 2.6 to 2.1%, according to an analysis by Barclays. If immigration returned to its 2017-18 level during Trump's first term, job growth would drop by 120,000, and our GDP would fall to 1.7%, Barclays predicts. Either way, the economy may be a casualty. And with that, we've come to the end of our reading of Barrons magazine for October 21st of 2024. This is your reader, Eric, saying be well, be safe, look after each other. Remember our veterans, especially those we've lost recently. Bye for now.